Well, it's so good to see you sharing and talking together, getting to meet people. You know, the new term is just upon us soon, and we're welcoming people to our campus already. So if you happen to be walking across campus and you're like, that person looks lost, they probably are. So just talk with them and see how you can help them and help them connect on campus. But we're so delighted to welcome those of you who are new to the campus community and maybe new to Origin. We have been in a series this summer through the life of David, of one that we call King David. So it's in the Old Testament. We're going to read this morning from 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5 is like a hinge. It's like the door is turning. In the previous chapters, we've been looking at the rise of this young man named David, who came from the sheep pens and was anointed to be king. And it took years before he finally became king of Judah, of the southern tribe. But in our passage today, he becomes king over a united Israel. All the 12 tribes of Israel are united now under David as king. And so this passage serves as a hinge from the rise to the reign. We're going to move in the next series of talks into the reign of David's life as king. But I want us to focus today on an aspect of our own storytelling and story making as followers of Jesus and even as his church. And that is that we all come to places in our life where we're like, I have arrived. I'm living my dream. I attained the goal. I got to that special place. How many of you watched some kind of event in the Olympics? Even if it was a replay, you saw it. All of us saw it. Okay, so all of us saw a replay of some kind of event at the Olympics. Do you think the day before they just woke up and were like, I think I'll go to the Olympics today and compete. I think I'll go ride a bike in the longest Olympic bike ride ever and win it. Do you think it was just the day before? No, we know it wasn't. So 18 months before this series of Olympics, Remco Evenepoel, a Belgian racer, was dreaming about being in the Olympics. He was preparing for the Olympics, and he had a terrible accident on a bike. And everyone thought, that's it. He's not going to go to the Tour de France. He's not going to go to the Olympics. He is finished. But he says as he was lying on a table getting ready, all he could begin to do was envision what it would be like to win that 272-kilometer bike race at the Olympics. And he began to envision it every day. He began to even think about, what is the celebration going to be like? But that seems crazy to do, right? He was a wrecked, broken bicyclist. Why would he go further? When he got his Olympic placement, don't you think everyone said, you've arrived. That's enough. At least you're here to compete. It wasn't enough. In the race, he was winning, he was losing, he was winning, he was losing, he was behind. And then just 10 minutes from the finish line at the Olympics, one of his tires blew out. Did you all know this? Have none of you seen this race? My bike racer right here. He's a cycling aficionado, so his tire blew out. He says it felt like an eternity as they caught up with him, replaced the tire. He says, when I went back and looked, it actually happened very fast. But he says, everything slowed down for me. And do you know what he was envisioning and imagining inside? He was imagining the picture of the celebration that he'd been imagining for months, of him at the finish line, with the Eiffel Tower framing him in the distance, with his bike in front of him, with his hands thrown up in victory, and no one else coming down the raceway. And he did it. If you go Google his name and look for the picture, you will find it. He's standing there, crossed the finish line with his bike, no competitor in view, and the Eiffel Tower framing him as a victor. Do you know what we say about vision? If you can't see it, you won't see it. If you can't see it yet, you won't see it. When Dallas Willard's mother was passing away, and she knew her life was ebbing from her, she turned to her husband, and she told her husband, take care of the children, give them heaven. Give them heaven. In her dying words, she said, you need to create a vision for their life. Give them heaven. And he did. And it became the motto of Dallas Willard's life, to say that the greatest vision in our life is our life in the communion of God. So give them heaven. But in between now and heaven, you and I are living a lot of different dreams, aren't we? So was David. David was living that dream that God had given him, that he would be king. But there were some other pieces to his dream as well. And I believe that in this chapter, we're given three things that David was having to pause and consider about his life. What kind of king am I going to be? What kind of city am I going to build? What kind of home am I going to have? 2 Samuel chapter 5. Follow along as I read. Then all the tribes of Israel went to David at Hebron and told him, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the one who really led the forces of Israel. And the Lord told you, you will be the shepherd of my people Israel. You will be Israel's leader. So there at Hebron, King David made a covenant before the Lord with all the elders of Israel, and they anointed him king of Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in all. He had reigned over Judah from Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, and from Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. David then led his men to Jerusalem to fight against the Jebusites, the original inhabitants of the land who were living there. The Jebusites taunted David, saying, you'll never get in here. Even the blind and lame could keep you out. For the Jebusites thought they were safe. But David captured the fortress of Zion, which is now called the City of David. On the day of the attack, David said to his troops, I hate those lame and blind Jebusites. Whoever attacks them should strike by going into the city through the water tunnel. That is the origin of the saying, the blind and the lame may not enter the house. So David made the fortress his home, and he called it the City of David. He extended the city, starting at the supporting terraces and working inward. And David became more and more powerful because the Lord God of heaven's armies was with him. Then King Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David along with cedar timber and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built David a palace. And David realized that the Lord had confirmed him as king over Israel and had blessed his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. After moving from Hebron to Jerusalem, David married more concubines and wives, and they had more sons and daughters. These are the names of David's sons who were born in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nephag, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliaphilet. Now that seems so far removed from us, doesn't it? But we've all had the experiences of arriving at some point in our life. Some of you dreamed of coming to UBC, and you got here. Some of you maybe dreamed of going somewhere else, but you got here. And so here you are. But you have arrived at a point in a juncture in your life, and it's a good time to ask yourself, what kind of person am I going to be here? David, perhaps, is having to ask that of himself. What kind of king am I going to be? What kind of city do I want to build as my central space of governance? What kind of home am I going to have? What kind of family will I build? Before a couple gets married, typically we invite them to do some premarital counseling. And the premarital work is not about just planning the wedding day. It's about asking, what kind of life do you want to have? At this juncture, even as readers of this text, we should be asking ourselves, what kind of king is David going to be? What kind of city is David constructing? What is he building? I know some of you planner type peoples out there would love that question. But what kind of home is David going to have as well? Others were wondering that too. For as the northern tribes of Israel came to David, they're actually trying to prompt David to think about what kind of king you're going to be. Did you notice that in verses 1 through 5? They came to David and said, you've sort of been the king ever since you started serving in Saul's court. You've been doing kingly things all along, is basically what they're saying. And then they say, but you have been called by God to be the shepherd of his people and Israel's leader. Israel's prince is the word. The first word they use to describe David is to say, you have been the shepherd. Now, if David was suffering from imposter syndrome, he would have hated to have them say, you're going to be a shepherd. Because where did David come from? He came from the shepherd's pen. He was the forgotten child who was out taking care of the sheep. If he had imposter syndrome at this point, he would be thinking, well, I shouldn't really be here. You know, I came from the shepherd's pen. And then here they are, they say, you're the shepherd. Oh, wow, you just stabbed me in the heart. I'm the king. No, you're the shepherd. And they're trying to draw David back to how to use his power. That the shepherd is called to give his or her life for the benefit of the sheep, the benefit of the flock. that while they are relating to the sheep, their primary concern is for the sheep. How are the sheep doing? And then the second thing they call David to is to be a leader. But they use a really interesting word. Instead of using the word for king, which is melech, they used prince. You are the prince of Israel. You are a leader, a prince of Israel. And they're leaving room for a larger theological vision that God is actually the king of Israel. And they're recalling perhaps the warnings that Samuel had given when Israel came and said, "We want a king." And Samuel was so sad because he's like, "Oh, you're rejecting God. You don't need a king. God is your king." But they insisted. And so God allowed Samuel to anoint Saul as king. But on the way, Samuel tells them, this is a bad decision. Because someday this is what the kings are going to do. This king is going to reign over you, Samuel said. This king will draft your sons and assign them to his chariots and his charioteers and make them run in front of his chariots. Some will be generals and captains in his army. Some will be forced to plow in his fields and harvest his crops. And some will make his weapons and chariot equipment. The king will take your daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. He will take away the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his own officials. He will take a tenth of your grain and your grape harvest and distribute it among his officers and attendants. Is this starting to sound bad? How many of you feel a little bit of resentment when you get your pay stub and you're like, oh, look at the taxes go? I mean, this is what Samuel is describing. And he goes on. He says, he will take your male and female slaves and demand the finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. He will demand a tenth of your flocks, and you will be his slaves. When that day comes, you will beg for relief from this king you are demanding. But then the Lord will not help you. So maybe, as the northern tribes were coming to David, they're asking, what kind of king are you going to be? And so they remind him, you've been called to be a shepherd, and you've been called to be a prince under the true king of heaven's armies. Notice the use of that phrase in this passage. The heaven's armies are ruled by God. The second thing that is being asked of David perhaps is, what kind of city is he going to build? Where will he govern? Where will he build a governing community that will unite both the north and the south together in one place? Is there any neutral ground available to David? He was ruling then in Hebron, and it was firmly within the tribe of Judah. But was there anywhere else he could have gone? And he chose Jerusalem. Jerusalem at that time was still ruled by the Jebusites. The Jebusites were part of the Canaanites who were present in the land when Joshua came across with the people of Israel. A few tribes tried to take that city. They even won, but they couldn't stay. The Jebusites kicked them out. And so there, for years, for centuries, this city had remained in the hands of the Jebusites. Some think that this issue of the lame and the blind was actually the Jebusites making fun of Israel, making fun of the patriarchs of Israel. One went blind, and one was lame and walked with a limp? We're not sure. It's a strange phrase here. But however it was used to taunt David, to say, you can't get here. We can defend this city on a hill, this fortress that's on this bare outcrop of land, this Zion place. We can defend it, and you can't have it. But David, being a strategician, figured out a way. He said, go through the water supply. We'll take that city. And so he did. He took that city, but still the question remains, what kind of city is it going to be? What kind of governing center will David create? What kind of community will be gathered there? Will it include others, or will it exclude them? Will the lame and the blind be welcomed? Will all the tribes of Israel have a place there? And there's a very interesting phrase in verse 10 that gives us a glimpse of what might actually be possible. It says there that David grew more and more powerful. Eugene Peterson says of that phrase, it's actually two images, that David grew so that he had a longer stride and a larger embrace. A larger stride, a confident stride, and a larger embrace. Jerusalem captures the imagination of God's people. We read Psalm 84 earlier. It's a later psalm from David. The sons of Korah wrote it, saying that they loved to be in the temple in Jerusalem. They loved to pilgrimage to Jerusalem in order to meet God together. That was the kind of place and community, perhaps, that David was envisioning. The third thing that we find here is that David is going to build a home. He's going to build a house. And another king comes from Tyre and brings all of the lumber and all of the craftsmen to build a house. Do you think David had time to build his own house, to do it himself? He didn't. He was having to rule. He was having to relate. He was having to serve as a judge at times. He was having to continue to defend the land. But God provided someone to build him a house. And then it appears that David started to fill the house. The passage ends with all the sons and daughters that are born in Jerusalem. This one was born here. This one was born here. And so the question should be rising up in us, well, what kind of dad was David? What kind of home life did he have? Don't you yourself ask yourself these questions? If you don't, I want to encourage you to take a pause in this next week and to ask yourself, well, what kind of leader am I going to be? What kind of leader am I? What kind of leader am I going to be at my workplace? What kind of leader am I going to be in my faculty? What kind of leader am I going to be in my neighborhood? What kind of leader am I going to be in all the places where I get to make decisions? Are you going to take the role and attitude of a shepherd? Or are you just going to look after your own interests? The second question is this: what kind of city are you going to build? What kind of community do you want to live in? What kind of neighborhood do you want to be a part of? What kind of church are we building together with Jesus? These are really important questions. And then the third is, what kind of home life are you building? What are you doing with the space you occupy? And some of you are like, I just have a box to live in. It's just a tiny dorm room. But what are you doing with that space? Even by yourself, your vocation is still to Jesus, just as a married couple's vocation is to Jesus. And so what are you doing with the stewardship of your space? What kind of home are you creating? What kind of hospitality is present there? What kind of vibe does the place give off because of the spiritual work you're doing there? And then if you do have more than yourself there in a home space, what kind of friend are you? What kind of spouse are you? What kind of father or mother are you? What kind of daughter and son are you? What are you doing in that space that's actually living into a vision that's bigger than you, that comes from God of heaven's armies? For some of us, these questions strike terror in our hearts. One, some of us, we're just like, give me the day and I'll take whatever comes. Don't ask me about that kind of stuff. I'm just going to live it in the moment. David was very much a live in the moment person, but he was also a poet. So don't you know he had time to think and to imagine and to pursue God and ask God, well, God, what do you think? The psalmist in Psalm 139 says, your thoughts are so precious to me. So if you're not sure, ask God to help you. Some of you find terror in this, not because you're shallow, but because you actually have a deep experience of it not going well. You have a deep experience of leaders who hurt you. You have a deep experience of communities that nothing seemed to go well in. You have a deep experience of home not going so well. And so you wonder, I'm just going to be an imposter. I have no idea how to be a father, how to be a mother, how to be a wife, how to be a husband. I have no idea how to be a friend. The invitation in the life of the church is to look around with Jesus and say, who could I learn from? Who could I watch? David had no idea how to be a good king. He'd only had one example, and that was Saul. Does anybody want to be like Saul? No, if you know about Saul, you're like, I don't want to be like Saul. So David didn't have an example. He only had the calling of God, his shepherd. That became his example, I believe. In Psalm 23, David says of the great example of the shepherd king, the Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green pastures. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever. David had found an example. God, the shepherd king of Israel. And we have even more to be able to grow into. As we come to the Lord's table together, today, we recall and remember that Jesus himself said, I am the good shepherd. Jesus took the role of the humble king who comes into Jerusalem as a shepherd. We have the example of the Father who says, I'm giving and projecting for you a day when I will give a new Jerusalem, a new city that will come down out of heaven, and I will wipe away every tear. We have the example of the Spirit of God who comes and says, I will nurture in you all of the fruit of God, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. In fact, Jesus says, those who know me, my Father will give the Spirit to them, and he will come and make our home in them. Oh. So some of you are going to live like kings and queens. You're going to be leaders. But what kind of leader will you be? Some of you are going to build cities and build communities. What kind of community and city will you build? And all of us are going to make our home somewhere. What kind of home will you make by the grace of Jesus? Let's stand together and pray.